state of innovation. How to debunk myths about the public sector and achieve more inclusive growth. Mariana Mazzucato, University of Sussex, Brighton.
When the wall fell, I was in Mexico, studying Marx's Das Kapital at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico.
Hello. So my only prop is lip gloss, but I'm not going to call Klaus to put it on, because I'm extremely dehydrated, so I might have to do that quickly. So what's interesting is that actually I'm going to talk about something that is not exactly what I've been researching for the last 20 years. It's actually what I realized no one was talking about in my research. It's related to this point here, which I'm going to talk about in the beginning and get to back in the end, but it's really the way that economists talk about the state in the process of economic growth and how blinded and limited that is, and how therefore it is also really impeding our ability in Europe, the US, all over the world today to achieve the kind of growth I think all of us in this room want, which is that kind of smart, innovation-led growth. And before I get to the sort of easier stuff, let me just make this kind of abstract point here, because it's perhaps the most important point, which I want to describe to you through some examples in just a minute. But basically, the way that economists talk about the state, and as you probably know, Keynes said something extremely smart, which is that even those people who think that they're just guided by practical concerns are actually slaves of defunct economists. So how economists think is actually quite important, so that you realize how to unshackle yourself from that, if you want, blindness, is really just about the state coming in and fixing different types of market failures. In innovation, of course, the most important market failure is the public good, which basic research is. It's very hard to appropriate the returns to it. So most people, left, right, center, agree that you need public funding to fund that kind of research. What I'm going to actually be talking to you about, which again economists don't talk about, that's why I have a historian up here, Karl Polanyi, who wrote this wonderful book in 1944, which is really about the state through its different types of organizations. This is not Big Brother ministry, but let's just call it public sector funding, actively shaping and creating markets, not just fixing them. And the power of that point, if you really, really understand it, I'm going to try to engage you with this point, is absolutely revolutionary. It would basically turn around everything we're currently doing today in Europe to achieve this kind of a smart growth, which we also hope is going to be inclusive and sustainable growth. Now, I do have to, because we are in Germany, sort of tell you the context, which I'm sure you know, which is that the whole narrative out there, here's my lip gloss, I'm telling you, I've taken about 10 airplanes in the last 20 days, and it's caused me to be permanently dehydrated. Klaus, don't worry about that. Is all about that somehow, Europe is in a big mess, as is a lot of the rest of the world. Why? Because it's so heavily indebted, right? These figures here, never mind the fact that this actually shows you the truth, that it was actually private debt that got us into the crisis, not public debt. Anyway, this sort of narrative that we need to, reduce that debt, of course, brings us to all sorts of policies around structural reforms, which are going to try to make everything sort of quicker, getting rid of all these rigidities and the bureaucracy. Of course, we hear lots about the need to lower tax, but of course, lower spending. Okay? Now, the pigs, my husband always says, be careful, you look German even though you're Italian, so make sure people know you're Italian when you put up this figure here. The pigs is, of course, a word that Goldman Sachs coined to talk about Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. We're slowly having to add lots of other letters to that, which is that the particular countries that are so heavily indebted are, if you want, this southern periphery country, which then causes all these tensions, and if you want, lack of solidarity, new walls coming up in Europe. And of course, one of the biggest problems right now are these 45% youth unemployment rates all over this southern periphery, which, by the way, is very undemocratic. If we want to go back to the minister's inspirational speech, 45% youth unemployment is not democratic, right? So let's be careful when we talk about the, if you want, falling down of walls. There's all sorts of walls coming up. And the problem with that kind of analysis, of course, is as soon as you start looking at the real figures and separate deficit, right, which is, if you want, the annual flow of the debt from the stock, the debt to GDP, you see something striking. Lots of these southern, peripheral, weaker countries compared to the core have actually not been spending that much, right? So the deficit both before the crisis in places like Italy was actually lower than Germany's. Okay, even in 2010, once these debts started to balloon even more, Spain's was less than the one of the UK. The real problem is the denominator of debt to GDP. Countries like Italy, and I've just put that little graph there for you to look at if you can see it, for the last 20 years have not been spending on those areas that actually increase productivity growth. Okay? And hence also national growth rates, which means the denominator of debt to GDP hasn't been growing. So even with a little deficit or a modest deficit, debt to GDP can actually escalate because that denominator is growing actually at zero. And in fact, if you ask yourself, well, what causes productivity growth, which lots of us in this room obviously care about, well, things like R&D spending, and that's what the pigs are bad at. Okay? The pigs are not spending too much. They're spending too little. And almost all the different indicators we can look at which determine this kind of long-run, smart, innovation-led growth. This is not the narrative you hear. How many of you have actually heard that Greece, Spain, and Portugal should be spending more on human capital, on education, on research, on the kind of institutes that you have here in Germany, the Fraunhofer Science Industry Links? Very little of that. That is currently completely out of the debate. Now, what's interesting when we look at the US, which is often described to us as somehow less burdened by heavy state apparatus, thank you, is that in fact over the last years, it has in fact over the last 70 years, has been spending immensely in all the different areas that increase productivity growth. It has not because they've been tightening their belts, it's actually because they've been increasing the spending even under the Reagan years, which I'll show you in a minute. Lots of the different spending in areas that drive long-run productivity were increasing from the public budget. But more recently, again, coming back to the 3% kind of deficits that we're being asked to constrain ourselves with in Europe, Obama actually had a 10% deficit spending in 2009 in order to, if you want to achieve the kind of growth that the US is slowly getting back to today, 4% versus the negative 0 or close to 1% that we're having in lots of the weaker parts of Europe today. And what's interesting about that, this is not just spending money, oh, government spend, spend, spend. Of course, that's not the point, but actually directing that spending in particular areas, governments choosing, God forbid, trying to pick winners. Okay, this is some data here for the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which, by the way, also included increasing the funding for agencies like ARPA-E, which today is trying to do for renewable energy what DARPA did for the Internet. The Internet, right? I mean, what we're often described, what we're often told about Silicon Valley, and we're trying to copy that in Europe. We're again trying to bring things like Tech City or Silicon Roundabout in the UK. There's initiatives like this all over the world. When we think of Silicon Valley, we think of the genius entrepreneurs, we think of the venture capitalists. And actually, everything that makes your iPhone a smartphone and not an idiotic phone was funded by the public budget, which, yes, in the short term increased deficits, and in the longer term decreased debt to GDP because they have in fact fostered that long-run growth of that denominator. This is, you probably can't see this, but these are the different types of public institutions, not only in the US, of course also CERN, in Europe, which led to all the things that make that iPhone smart: internet, GPS, touchscreen display, even the Siri voice-activated system, which never works on my phone, but apparently is very useful, funded by the public sector, right? So DARPA, the CIA has one of the biggest public venture capital funds, funded some of the technologies behind these, if you want, almost general-purpose technologies. And in fact, this worries lots of people because lots of that, keeps repeating the word army, defense, military. This looks like the military-industrial complex. But what's interesting, and I'm sure Paul Nurse will remind us about this later, is that, in fact, this kind of funding model has been applied across the board to energy and to health. I've already mentioned the energy with the ARPA-E budget, but this is how much the US government, even after the crisis, spends on fueling the knowledge base behind biotechnology and pharmaceuticals. Okay, so in 2012, close to $31 billion. That's a lot of money, and believe me, that increased that deficit. What's interesting about this funding is, first of all, it's across the entire innovation chain. This is not just about basic research. It's a lot of that great blue sky thinking, but also the applied research, but also that it's actually been responsible for something like 75% of the most revolutionary new drugs. This is the research of Marcia Angels, ex-editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, who's shown that because unfortunately private pharma tends to stick more to the Me Too type drugs, more of the D of the R&D, and something which we'll talk about in a minute, which is share buybacks, but we'll get to that. Now, as I said, this is across the entire innovation chain. This is not just the classic market failure basic research, right? This shows you here just how much the US government, the market system, has been spending through government budgets, not just on research, but even the early stage seed finance of companies, Compaq, Intel, even Apple through a similar program. SPIC got lots of this early stage financing. This is a small business innovation research program which over time has actually had to increase its budget. Why? Well, if you've had anything to do with venture capitalists, you will know that the first thing that's in their head is the exit, right? And that exit should happen in something like 3, maximum 5 years. Always closer to 3, unfortunately, through an IPO or a buyout. And unfortunately, that innovation chain that we all know about actually takes 15 to 20 years. Even that Death Valley phase, which in theory the VCs are supposed to fund, can actually last quite a long time. And so this is just a fact. This is a historical fact. The problem is because we don't talk about it, we tend to hype up some of the actors, like the venture capitalists, and hype down, and hence also underfund, in some parts of the world, these kind of very important strategic, mission-oriented, not market failure-oriented public budgets. And also, what's very important, if we look around what's happening in Europe, is that this money is direct. This is not about, achieving innovation-led growth through tax incentives, just R&D tax credits, or reduce corporate tax, or reduce capital gains tax, or introduce the patent box, which is a very problematic tax policy we've just introduced in the UK. This is about actually funding things directly. This is the gray stuff, direct. Blue is the indirect. The US, it's almost all direct. This, again, doesn't mean that any government just simply spending money directly is going to achieve growth. This also means that you have to attract that kind of expertise into your public institutions. So the US Department of Energy, which founded that ARPA-E institution I mentioned before, was run up until 6 months ago by a Nobel Prize-winning physicist. How cool is that? Right? Now, the only way to attract that kind of expertise is actually to create missions for these agencies, which go beyond this kind of market failure, little fixing of different problems after they've arrived. And how to achieve that kind of mission-orientedness in these agencies is absolutely fundamental. Clean technology, which I know that lots of us will be talking about today, so renewable energy, we've already heard about it twice, is of course fundamental. And what I'm seeing when I look at this is exactly what one saw with biotech, nanotech, internet, which is that upper right-hand quadrant of high capital intensity, high technological market risk, has almost no private financing. Interestingly, in this particular sector, not so much IT, what we're also seeing is the rise of these new agents, public banks, which together, just 4 very active public banks, one of the ones here in Germany, the KfW, Brazil's BNDES, China's China Development Bank, and the European Investment Bank, together, just those 4 banks are spending almost 4 times as much as the worldwide private sector funding of renewable energy, private equity, VC, corporate, and stock market. Now, again, this is just a fact. The problem is we don't have a way to talk about it. So often these same agencies that are trying to be strategic and mission-oriented end up getting accused that they're crowding out. Crowding out the private sector because we don't even have indicators through which to talk about what they're doing, which is, again, creating new markets, not just fixing little problems within them. Again, Germany, this is the numbers for the German KfW, which is fascinating because not only did they do what Keynes said, which is counter-cyclical government funding, right? The public sector should not repeat what the private sector is doing, which is retreating from the real economy. It should step in precisely when private banks have stepped out, but it has also directed this funding towards the green mission in Germany, which is very much of a mission. This is the Energiewende strategy, which is not just about solar, wind, and biofuels. This is also about green cities and greening the entire economy. And again, I also mentioned those Fraunhofer Institutes, which, you know, if you look at the German innovation ecosystem, this is really something that should be guiding the kind of recipes in the southern periphery if we want this kind of smart innovation-led growth. No discussion about that. I saw 47 seconds. Anyway, and just to finish, I mean, we can't do this alone. This is not just about the state doing everything. Of course, you need an engaged private sector. Unfortunately, not only do we see private budgets falling on our part of R&D worldwide, we also have this extreme problem of financialization, which is how much companies are spending just on share buybacks, 22 seconds left, to boost their stock prices, stock options, and hence executive pay. But this is actually increasing. Apple did no share buybacks under Steve Jobs. This is Tim Cook's new big plan. This, to me, is the actual source of income inequality. How much we are actually rewarding today value extraction over value creation. And the only way to end that is to have a new theory of where does wealth come from. Thank you.